If you're watching this alone, pause for a second. Notice the silence around you. That silence is not empty. It's Seb's receptive. There are things the mind refuses to hear when it feels observed. Thoughts that stay hidden when noise is present. Patterns that remain invisible when attention is divided. That's why this message was never meant to be shared. It only works when you are alone. Not because it's secret, but because the mind opens differently when no one is watching. The moment you remove the audience, defenses drop, filters loosen, awareness deepens. If you're here right now, it means something in you is ready to reorganize. You don't need to agree with what you hear. You don't need to believe anything. All you need to do is listen without resistance. Because once the mind recognizes clarity, it cannot return to confusion. And what you're about to hear does not change your life immediately. It changes how your mind listens to life. That sets when everything else follows. 1. The mind opens when it feels unseen. There is a version of your mind that only appears when no one is watching. Not physically watching, but psychologically present. The moment another person is nearby, the mind changes its posture. It straightens itself. It measures. It edits. It begins to perform. Even in silence, it senses an audience. And in the presence of an audience, truth becomes filtered. This is why your most honest thoughts rarely arrive in conversation. They come when you are alone, late at night, in still moments, when there is no one to impress, explain yourself to, or protect yourself from. The mind is not dishonest around others. It is cautious. Caution creates tension. Tension creates noise. And noise blocks access to deeper layers of awareness. When you are alone, something subtle but powerful happens. The nervous system relaxes. The need to manage perception disappears. The inner guard steps aside. And only then does the mind stop defending and start revealing. This is not weakness. It is biological intelligence. The brain evolved to survive in groups, to monitor a threat, to scan for judgment, to adapt behavior based on who is present. That survival mechanism is always active when others are around, even if you feel comfortable. But solitude disables that system. Without an audience, the mind no longer needs to protect an image. It no longer needs to explain itself. It no longer needs to maintain a story. And when the story collapses, truth becomes audible. That's why clarity feels sudden when it arrives alone. It doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It simply appears complete and undeniable. This is also why many people avoid being alone, not because they dislike silence, but because silence removes the mask. And once the mask is gone, the mind has no choice but to face itself. When you sit alone long enough, the surface thoughts exhaust themselves. The repetitive worries fade. The familiar loops lose energy, and beneath them, something deeper starts speaking. That voice is not emotional. It is not dramatic. It is precise. It doesn't instead shout. It doesn't beg. It waits. This is the layer where real change begins. Not through motivation, but through recognition. Not through effort, but through understanding. If you've ever felt like you suddenly knew something while alone, about yourself, about a decision, about your direction, that wasn't coincidence. That was access. Your mind didn't just become smarter. It became unobserved. And in that unobserved state, it finally told you the truth. 2. Attention is a frequency. Your attention is not passive. It is not just something you give to the world. It is something that actively shapes your internal state. Wherever your attention rests, your mind begins to organize itself around that point. Most people think attention is harmless. They scroll, listen, watch, consume, unaware that each moment of focus is training the mind to vibrate at a certain level. Attention is a tuning mechanism. When your attention is scattered, your thoughts become fragmented. When it is shallow, your understanding remains surface level. And when it is constantly pulled in multiple directions, the mind never stabilizes long enough to perceive anything clearly. This is why focus feels powerful, not because it adds something, but because it removes interference. When attention becomes steady, the mind synchronizes, thoughts slow down, internal noise fades, and in that quiet coherence, perception sharpens. That is what people describe as a shift in frequency. Not energy in a mystical sense, but alignment. Less contradiction, less internal friction. Your mind becomes a single signal instead of a collection of competing ones. This is also why distraction feels draining. Every interruption forces the mind to retune itself. Over time, this creates fatigue, restlessness, and a sense of mental disorganization that people mistake for stress. It is instead stress. It's just frequency instability. When you choose where your attention goes, intentionally, without interruption, you stabilize the signal, and a stable signal carries power. It influences how you interpret events, how you respond emotionally, and how clearly you think. The mind doesn't change through force, it changes through focus. And when attention becomes deliberate, the mind stops reacting and starts responding. This is the moment when awareness becomes authority, not because the world changes, but because you are no longer fragmented within it. Your attention decides your frequency, and your frequency decides your experience. 3. Noise keeps you at the surface. Noise is not just sound. It is constant stimulation, unending input, a steady stream of information that never allows the mind to fully settle. Most people believe noise helps them cope. They keep something playing in the background. Music, videos, conversations, notifications. They tell themselves it helps them relax. But what it actually does is keep the mind occupied at the surface. Noise prevents the mind from descending. When stimulation never stops, thoughts remain reactive. One idea triggers the next, and the next without resolution. There is movement, but no depth, activity, but no clarity. This is why people can be busy all day and still feel mentally empty. The mind hasn't gone anywhere meaningful. Depth requires stillness, and stillness feels uncomfortable at first because it exposes what noise was covering up: unfinished thoughts, suppressed emotions, questions without easy answers. Noise protects you from facing those things, but protection has a cost. When the mind never rests in silence, it never organizes itself. Patterns remain unseen. Priorities stay confused. Decisions feel heavy because the mind is cluttered with unresolved input. Silence, on the other hand, does something radical. It slows the internal tempo. At first, the mind resists. It produces random thoughts, old memories, sudden worries. This is not regression, it is release. The mind is clearing excess signal. If you stay with the silence long enough, the resistance fades, and beneath it, there is structure. You begin to notice which thoughts matter and which don't, which concerns are real and which are noise themselves, what deserves attention and what has been draining it. This is why silence feels powerful after the discomfort passes. It doesn't add insight, it reveals it. Noise keeps you reacting, silence returns you to choice, and choice is where control begins. 4. The subconscious listens. When the conscious relaxes, most people try to change their lives by forcing new thoughts. They repeat affirmations, push motivation, and attempt to overpower old patterns with willpower. When it doesn't work, they assume something is wrong with them. But the issue isn't just effort. It sips timing. The subconscious mind does not respond to pressure. It responds to permission. The conscious mind is designed to analyze, judge, and control. It questions everything. It interrupts. It argues. And as long as it stays dominant, deeper patterns remain locked in place. Real change begins when the conscious mind loosens its grip. This usually happens in moments of relaxation, just before sleep, during quiet solitude, when attention softens instead of tightens, when there is no urgency to fix anything. In these moments, the subconscious becomes receptive, not because you are trying to change it, but because it feels safe enough to listen. This is why insights often arrive unexpectedly, not while you're thinking hard, but when you stop trying, not during effort, but during ease. The subconscious learns through experience, emotion, and repetition. It does not understand commands. It understands states. When the body relaxes, the breath deepens, and mental noise fades, the subconscious opens its gate. That is when beliefs shift without resistance. That is when old patterns lose energy. That is when new perspectives embed themselves naturally. Trying to force change keeps the gate closed. Allowing awareness opens it. This is the paradox of the mind. The less you push, the more it moves. And when the conscious mind steps aside, the deeper intelligence finally takes over. 5. Your identity is a habit, not a fact. Most people believe they are something. They say, "This is just how I am. I've always been like this. This is my personality." But what they are really describing is repetition. Identity feels solid, but it is not fixed. It is practiced. Every thought you repeatedly accept trains the mind to expect itself. Every emotional reaction you repeat teaches the nervous system how to respond automatically. Over time, these patterns harden, not because they are true, but because they are familiar. Familiarity feels like truth. The mind prefers what it knows, even if what it knows limits you. This is why change feels uncomfortable, not because it is wrong, but because it threatens continuity. Your identity is the most efficient shortcut your mind has. It prevents you from having to decide who to be in every moment. It automates behavior. It saves energy. But automation comes at a cost. Once an identity is formed, the mind begins defending it. Evidence that supports it is amplified. Evidence that challenges it is ignored. Experiences are interpreted in ways that reinforce the existing self-image. This happens quietly, unconsciously. You don't notice the mind filtering reality because it feels like reality itself. That's why people can live inside the same limitations for years without questioning them. The identity loop closes in on itself. Thought creates belief. Belief shapes behavior. Behavior produces results. Results reinforce belief. And the cycle continues. But here is the key. A habit can be interrupted. Identity only feels permanent because it is constantly being rehearsed. The moment repetition stops, rigidity weakens. This is why solitude is so powerful. When you are alone, you are no longer performing an identity for others. You are not being reflected back to yourself through reactions, expectations, or labels. The feedback loop breaks, and in that break, space appears. Space between who you've been and who you could be. At first, that space feels uncomfortable, empty, uncertain. The mind rushes to fill it with old definitions, old stories, old explanations. But if you resist the urge to immediately define yourself, something important happens. You begin to observe your identity instead of inhabiting it. You notice the tone of your inner voice, the assumptions you make about your capabilities, the limits you accept without evidence. And once identity becomes observable, it becomes flexible. This is the moment most people never reach because it requires patience without reassurance. It requires sitting in the unknown without rushing to conclusions. But this is also where real change begins, not by declaring a new identity, not by forcing confidence, but by loosening attachment to the old one. When the mind is no longer committed to defending who it thinks it is, it becomes curious. Curious minds learn faster. They adapt more easily. They respond instead of react. This is why transformation feels quiet at first. There is no dramatic shift, no sudden announcement, just subtle changes in perception, different choices, slightly altered reactions, and over time, repetition resumes, but now in a new direction. A new identity forms, not because you decided who to be, but because you practiced a different way of thinking. That is the truth most people miss. You don't just become someone new by declaring it. You become someone new by behaving differently long enough for the mind to catch up. Identity follows behavior, not the other way around. And once you understand that, you realize something powerful. Nothing about who you are is as permanent as it feels. 6 emotions are signals, not obstacles. Most people experience emotions as interruptions, something they must control, suppress, or escape. When an uncomfortable feeling arises, the instinct is immediate. Distract yourself, rationalize it away, or label it as weakness. But emotions are not malfunctions. They are data. Every emotional response is a signal sent by the nervous system to the conscious mind, not to overwhelm you, but to inform you. And when those signals are ignored repeatedly, they don't disappear, they intensify. This is why suppressed emotions return stronger. Anxiety does not come from nowhere. It signals misalignment between expectation and reality. It tells you that your mind is anticipating threat, loss, or uncertainty faster than your conscious awareness can manage. Restlessness signals unused energy. Attention trapped without direction. A mind ready to act but unsure where to move. Sadness signals unresolved meaning. Something important has not been integrated, understood, or accepted. These signals are precise, but precision requires listening. Most people never listen long enough to understand what the emotion is pointing toward. They react instead. They attach stories. They personalize the feeling and make it part of their identity. I am anxious. I am angry. I am broken. But emotions are not identities. They are messages. When you sit with an emotion without trying to fix it, something unexpected happens. The intensity changes. Not because it is suppressed, but because it has been acknowledged. Acknowledgement is regulation. The nervous system calms when it feels heard, just like a warning light on a dashboard turns off once the issue is addressed. Emotional signals quiet down when they are processed correctly. This requires stillness, and stillness is uncomfortable because emotions surface more clearly without distraction. But discomfort is not danger. It is information moving into awareness. When you allow an emotion to be present without resistance, it begins to reveal its structure. You notice patterns, triggers, underlying beliefs attached to it. This is where power returns, because once you understand the signal, you can respond intelligently instead of reacting impulsively. You no longer fear the emotion, you use it. Fear becomes caution. Anger becomes boundary awareness. Sadness becomes clarity. Emotional intelligence is not about staying calm all the time. It is about staying conscious long enough to decode what you feel. People who master this do not suppress emotion. They translate it, and translation changes everything. Instead of being pushed around by internal states, you begin navigating by them. Emotions stop controlling behavior and start guiding decisions. This is what emotional maturity actually looks like. Not numbness, not constant positivity, but accurate interpretation. When emotions are treated as signals instead of enemies, they lose their power to overwhelm. They become allies. And once that happens, inner resistance fades and clarity replaces chaos. 7. Your mind mirrors your expectations. The mind is not a passive observer of reality. It is a predictive system. Before anything happens, your mind is already preparing for what it expects to happen. It scans the environment not for truth, but for confirmation. Confirmation that the world behaves the way it believes it does. This process happens quietly. automatically, and continuously. If you expect rejection, your mind notices hesitation. If you expect failure, it magnifies obstacles. If you expect opportunity, it detects openings others miss. Nothing about the external situation changes, only the filter through which it is perceived. This is why two people can experience the same event and walk away with completely different conclusions. Their expectations guided what they noticed, how they interpreted it, and what meaning they assigned to it. Expectation is not hope, it is orientation. The mind uses expectations to conserve energy. By predicting outcomes, it reduces uncertainty. But this efficiency comes with a cost. Once a prediction is formed, the mind becomes invested in proving itself right. This is how limiting beliefs survive. When you expect limitation, the mind selectively gathers evidence. Success is dismissed as luck. Failure is treated as proof. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing loop that feels like reality itself. The same mechanism works in reverse. When expectations shift, perception reorganizes. You don't suddenly become unrealistic. You become receptive. Possibilities that were previously invisible begin to register. This is not positive thinking. This is not positive thinking. It is cognitive alignment. The mind does not need certainty to move forward. It needs direction. Expectations provide that direction. But here is the part most people miss. Expectations are not chosen consciously most of the time. They are inherited from past experiences, from repeated outcomes, from interpretations formed long ago and never questioned. A single painful experience can shape years of expectation. The mind remembers emotion more than facts, so it protects itself by preparing for similar outcomes. What begins as self-protection slowly becomes self-limitation. Breaking this cycle requires awareness. You must notice the assumption before the reaction. The quiet "this won't work" before effort fades. The subtle withdrawal before rejection ever occurs. Once expectation becomes visible, it loses authority. At that point, you can test new expectations, not by forcing belief, but by allowing openness, by leaving room for different outcomes instead of predicting the same one repeatedly. This flexibility shifts frequency. When the mind stops clinging to prediction, it becomes adaptive. It responds instead of anticipates. And responsiveness is far more powerful than certainty. Reality does not respond to what you want. It responds to what you expect consistently. Change the expectation, and the experience begins to follow. Not immediately, not magically, but inevitably. 8. Solitude amplifies intention. Most intentions are weak, not because they are unclear, but because they are diluted. They are formed in noise, spoken casually, and immediately buried under distraction. The mind hears them, but it does not register them as important. Intentions only carry power when they carry weight. Solitude provides that weight. When you are alone, intention is no longer performative. There is no one to impress, convince, or justify yourself to. There is no external feedback loop reinforcing or challenging your decision. There is only alignment between thought, feeling, and attention. This alignment sharpens intention. In solitude, the mind stops negotiating. It cannot outsource responsibility or delay commitment. The intention stands alone, exposed and unmistakable. This is why private decisions change lives more often than public declarations. Public intentions are often shaped by expectation. They are adjusted to sound reasonable, acceptable, or impressive. Private intentions have no such filters. They reflect truth more than image, and truth carries force. The mind responds differently to intentions formed in silence. It treats them as internal directives rather than abstract wishes. Neural resources begin organizing around them. Attention subtly reorients. Choices begin aligning without conscious effort. This is not motivation. It is coherence. When intention is clear and undisturbed, the mind begins scanning reality for relevance. Opportunities that match the intention become noticeable. Distractions lose appeal. Energy stops leaking into unrelated pursuits. Solitude does not create intention. It purifies it. It removes excess. It strips away impulse. It reveals what actually matters beneath surface desires. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. Silence forces you to confront conflicting intentions, things you say you want versus what you consistently choose, goals inherited from others versus desires that are genuinely yours. But once that conflict is resolved, intention stabilizes. A stable intention is powerful, not because it demands results, but because it influences behavior consistently over time. This is why people who change quietly often change permanently. Their intention was not fueled by emotion or pressure. It was formed in stillness and reinforced through clarity. Solitude acts as an amplifier, not by making intention louder, but by removing everything that competes with it. And once intention stands unchallenged, the mind follows. 9. Stillness reveals patterns you missed. Most people believe they lack clarity because they haven't thought enough. In reality, they have thought too much. The mind, when constantly active, jumps from one thought to another without completing any cycle. This creates motion without insight, activity without understanding. Stillness interrupts this pattern. When the mind slows down, it stops chasing new input and begins reviewing existing information. Connections that were previously invisible start to emerge, not because they are new, but because the noise that hid them has finally quieted. Patterns are not created in stillness. They are uncovered. This is why insight often arrives unexpectedly, in moments when you are not trying to solve anything. When attention is relaxed and unforced, the mind shifts from problem-solving mode into integration mode. Integration is where meaning forms. In stillness, the mind begins organizing experiences chronologically, emotionally, and logically. You start noticing repetition, similar situations, familiar outcomes, the same emotional responses appearing in different contexts. What once felt like random events now appears as a sequence. This recognition can be uncomfortable. Patterns expose responsibility. They show where reactions replaced choices, where habits guided outcomes, where the same response produced the same result. Again and again, noise protects you from this awareness. Stillness removes the shield. But this discomfort is not punishment. It is precision. The mind is not judging. It is mapping. Once a pattern is seen clearly, it loses its grip. Repetition relies on unconsciousness. Awareness interrupts the loop. This is why people who slow down often change direction, not because they forced a decision, but because the old path no longer made sense once it was seen clearly. Stillness also reveals positive patterns, strengths you didn't recognize, decisions that quietly worked, moments where alignment already existed, but you can only see them when you stop moving long enough to look. The modern world rewards speed, reaction, and constant engagement. But speed blurs insight, reaction prevents reflection, and constant engagement keeps the mind externally oriented. Stillness reorients awareness inward, not to escape reality, but to understand it. When the mind is still, it becomes accurate. It stops exaggerating. It stops catastrophizing. It stops projecting. What remains is signal, clear, grounded, and actionable. And once you recognize the patterns shaping your life, you are no longer trapped by them. You are informed. And informed awareness is the beginning of real control. 10. Your mind responds to authority, even your own. The mind is not persuaded by repetition alone. It responds to authority. This is why the same thought can pass through your mind 100 times without effect, yet a single statement spoken with certainty can immediately alter your emotional state. The content matters, but the conviction behind it matters more. Authority tells the mind what is important. When you doubt your own thoughts, the mind treats them as suggestions. When you speak internally with hesitation, the subconscious remains unconvinced. It waits. It resists. It keeps old patterns in place. But when a decision is made with clarity and firmness, the mind listens. This does not require force. It requires coherence. Authority is not volume or aggression. It is alignment between intention, belief, and tone. When these elements match, the mind interprets the message as reliable. Most people outsource authority. They wait for validation from others. They trust external opinions more than internal direction. Over time, this trains the subconscious to ignore the inner voice and respond only to outside signals. This creates dependency. When authority lives outside you, confidence becomes fragile. Decisions feel uncertain. Action requires reassurance, but authority can be reclaimed. It begins by noticing how you speak to yourself, the language you use, the hesitation embedded in your inner dialogue, the way statements turn into questions before they are even finished. The mind notices this, and it mirrors it. If your inner voice is unsure, your behavior becomes inconsistent. If your internal direction wavers, follow-through weakens. But when the inner voice becomes calm and decisive, behavior aligns naturally. This is why self-trust is built through decisions, not thoughts. Each time you decide and follow through, the mind learns to recognize you as a reliable authority. Each time you hesitate and abandon your own direction, that authority weakens. Authority is earned internally the same way it is earned externally, through consistency. This is also why people who speak less but mean what they say feel powerful. Their words carry weight because they are backed by action. The subconscious does not respond to promises. It responds to evidence. When your actions match your words, authority strengthens. When they don't, the mind discounts future instructions. Over time, this shapes identity. You become someone your mind listens to. And once that happens, change accelerates. Not because life becomes easier, but because resistance disappears. The mind stops arguing. It stops sabotaging. It aligns behind direction. True authority is quiet, stable, undeniable. And when it comes from within, nothing outside you can override it. 11. Not everything is meant to be shared. There is a subtle mistake many people make when something begins to change inside them. They rush to speak about it. They explain it. They announce it. They seek confirmation that what they feel is real. But some shifts weaken the moment they are exposed. Not because they are fragile, but because they are unfinished. Transformation is a process, not an event. And processes require containment. They need space to stabilize before being subjected to external interpretation, opinion, or doubt. When you speak too early, you invite interference. Other people's perspectives reshape your experience before it has fully formed. Their questions pull you back into explanation mode. Their skepticism forces you to defend something that is still integrating. This redirects energy away from growth and toward justification. Silence protects momentum. This is why many powerful changes happen quietly, not because the person is hiding, but because they are incubating. When something is still becoming, it needs consistency more than attention. The mind treats shared experiences differently than private ones. When you share a realization, the mind begins to package it for communication. It turns inward awareness into outward narrative. That shift changes its function. Instead of deepening, the insight flattens. It becomes a concept instead of a lived truth. Private realizations, on the other hand, continue evolving. They refine themselves through experience rather than conversation. They shape behavior quietly, without needing approval. This is also why not everyone needs to understand what you are doing or why. Understanding is not required for alignment. When you act in accordance with something deeply understood internally, explanation becomes unnecessary. The results speak over time. Silence also strengthens intention. When there is no audience, there is no pressure to perform, no temptation to exaggerate, no need to maintain consistency for others rather than for yourself. You move honestly. This is not secrecy driven by fear. It is discretion driven by wisdom. Knowing what to share, and when to remain silent is a form of intelligence. It preserves clarity. It maintains direction. Many people lose their path not because it was wrong, but because it was crowded with voices too early. If something is changing inside you, let it finish its work. Let it shape your choices. Let it alter your reactions. Let it become stable. Then if you choose to share, you will no longer need validation. You will already know. 12. When the frequency shifts, reality follows. Most people believe reality changes first, and then the mind adapts. But the sequence is reversed. Reality responds last. What changes first is internal order. When the mind is fragmented, reality feels chaotic. When the mind is conflicted, choices feel heavy. When attention is scattered, outcomes feel random. This is not coincidence, it is correspondence. The external world reflects internal coherence. This is why two people can live in the same environment, face the same circumstances, and experience completely different lives. One sees obstacles everywhere. The other sees direction. One feels blocked. The other feels guided. The difference is not intelligence. It is alignment. Frequency is not mystical language. It is consistency. Consistency of thought. Consistency of emotional tone. Consistency of expectation and action. When these elements align, the mind becomes ordered, and an ordered mind makes different decisions. Those decisions, repeated, reshape outcomes. This is the part most people overlook. They wait for motivation, opportunity, or confidence to appear before acting. But action is not the result of alignment. It is the evidence of it. When frequency shifts internally, behavior changes quietly. You respond instead of react. You pause instead of rush. You choose instead of default. These small shifts compound. Over time, the environment begins responding differently, not because it changed, but because you did. People treat you differently because your boundaries are clearer. Opportunities appear because your attention is sharper. Confusion fades because your decisions are cleaner. This is how reality follows frequency, not dramatically, not overnight, but unmistakably. At first, the changes are subtle. A different conversation, a delayed reaction that once would have been impulsive, a decision that feels obvious instead of stressful. Then patterns begin to break. Situations that used to repeat stop returning. Conflicts that once drained you lose relevance. Desires that once felt urgent dissolve. This is not loss, it is refinement. As frequency stabilizes, the mind stops chasing stimulation. It no longer needs constant reassurance. It becomes self-referenced rather than externally driven. This is when life begins to feel quieter, not emptier, but clearer. And clarity is powerful. Clarity removes friction. Friction drains energy. Energy determines direction. When friction fades, movement becomes efficient. You waste less effort on what doesn't matter. You stop negotiating with distractions. You stop explaining yourself to people who don't need to understand. Your life becomes simpler, but not smaller. More intentional, more precise. This is also when intuition sharpens. Not because something supernatural happens, but because internal noise has dropped low enough for subtle signals to register. You notice timing. You sense when to wait and when to move. You feel when something is aligned and when it isn't. This isn't set luck. It's set sensitivity restored. The mind was always capable of this. It was just too crowded to function properly. When frequency shifts, you stop forcing outcomes. You stop chasing certainty. You trust process because you are no longer fighting yourself internally. And that internal peace changes how the world meets you. Resistance outside mirrors resistance inside. Flow outside mirrors flow inside. This is why trying to control life without internal alignment always fails. You can manage circumstances temporarily, but misalignment leaks back in through stress, indecision, and exhaustion. But when alignment becomes your baseline, effort reduces naturally. You still work, you still act, but you are no longer at war with yourself. That inner ceasefire is what changes everything. Reality does not reward desire. It responds to coherence. When your thoughts, emotions, expectations, and actions speak the same language, the signal becomes clear. And when the signal is clear, life answers. Not all at once, not perfectly, but progressively. This is the final lesson. Nothing you've heard in this video was meant to entertain you. It was meant to recalibrate you. If you've stayed until now, your mind has already begun reorganizing, not consciously, but structurally. You may not feel different yet, but awareness has shifted. And once awareness shifts, reversal is impossible. From this point forward, you will notice when you are misaligned. You will feel when noise is pulling you off center. You will recognize when silence is needed. That is the mark of integration. The frequency has changed. And from here on, reality has no choice but to follow. Before you return to the noise, stay here for a moment. Notice what feels different. Not dramatic, not emotional, just quieter. That quiet is not emptiness. It sets alignment. You don't need to remember everything you heard. The mind doesn't work that way. What mattered has already settled beneath awareness, where real change begins. From here on, you may start noticing things sooner. Discomfort before it turns into reaction. Distraction before it pulls you away. Clarity before confusion has a chance to form. That awareness is not something you gained. It's something you stopped blocking. You don't need to share this experience. You don't need to explain it. And you don't need to act immediately. Let it integrate. The mind adjusts quietly when it recognizes truth. And once it does, it doesn't go back. When you see ready, return to the world. But don't rush. Silence is still working.